So welcome back, everybody. Our first speaker is Jeffrey Kuhn. Jeffrey is the Regius Professor of Hebrew at the University of Cambridge in England. His research focuses on three main fields: biblical Hebrew language, especially the medieval traditions and the vocalization tradition, and Neo-Aramaic dialectology and medieval Arabic documents. He's the general editor of the Bar-Ilan Encyclopedia of Hebrew Language and Linguistics, and is the senior editor of the Journal of Semitic Studies. The most recent book that he published that is relevant for us here is the Tiberian Pronunciation Tradition of Biblical Hebrew that came out as an open access book in Open Book Publishers in 2020.
Good, well, thank you very much, Naama. Today I want to talk to you about innovations in the vocalism of verbal forms in the Second Temple period. So I want to look at developments in what could be called late Biblical Hebrew, because this workshop's about late Biblical Hebrew, in the morphosyntax of verbs as it's actually reflected by the Tiberian vocalization. Now, the Tiberian vocalization tradition, or the Tiberian reading tradition, which the vocalization signs represent, has historical roots in the Second Temple period. So one may be outspoken and say it's actually this layer of the biblical text, as we have it, is actually late Biblical Hebrew. And I haven't got time to go into all the justifications for this claim about the historical roots of the Tiberian pronunciation tradition, but it's suffice to say there's internal evidence for this in the distribution of the Karae and Ketiv within the Masoretic text. The Karae, of course, being the actual reading tradition itself reflected by the Tiberian signs. The fact that the Ketiv of the text of Chronicles often corresponds to the Karae of its earlier biblical source is actually a demonstration of this. For example, you get Migrasheha in 1 Chronicles 6, which is written and read in the reading tradition as the plural, and crucially it's written with the yod there, but its source in Joshua 21, it's written as a singular, looks like it's something like Migrashah, but it's actually the actual Karae, the reading tradition of Migrasheha. So we've got, in other words, the Ketiv of Chronicles is as early or the same date as or contemporary in some way with the Karae of Joshua 21. So another factor which is relevant for us this afternoon in my talk is the issue of language contact, because we're going to look at the way in which the reading tradition was susceptible to language contact and how this brought about change. And there are two factors I want to emphasize in language contact in the Second Temple period. One is resistance to influence of language contact to maintain distinctions, and enrichment of distinctions for functional purposes by licensing influence of language contact. So the name of the game, or the purpose, the main point of all this is that there was what I call an orthoepic tendency. There was an orthoepy in the Second Temple period, which aimed at maintaining distinctions or creating new distinctions for the sake of clarity of enunciation or clarity of meaning. So the innovative distinctions in the reading tradition, which I'm going to talk about, the innovative distinctions of the reading tradition of forms occur either in situations where there were originally forms that were read identically and they were distinct, they become distinct, or there are innovative distinctions at the time of composition in LBH. To contrast with other forms in the biblical corpus that would otherwise be identical in form. So let's start with an example. We've got two forms, umlal and ha'amelalim, in Nehemiah 3:34. Now, we've got two pieces of different morphology there. And all cases of umlal and its inflections are predicative, most with clear verbal inflection, whereas ha'amelalim is the only nominal form with nominal inflection, and it functions as an attributive adjective. So we have some examples here of a predicative or verbal use of the form umlal. So uforse michmorit al panei mayim umlalu. Umlal ani, I am languishing. So whereas the form amel alim is used as an adjective, ha-Yehudim ha-amel alim, the feeble Jews, in the late text, Nehemiah 3:34. So the form amel alim, as was pointed out by Bar-Ilan, is actually can be found in rabbinic Hebrew texts as reflected in orthography such as this one with a yod. And so it would appear that this amel alim was somehow corresponds in some way to rabbinic Hebrew. Now, one way of looking at this is that, in fact, a form in the tradition of the, say, CBH tradition of umlal was replaced by amel alim by opening the door, as it were, to influence from vernacular Hebrew. That is to say, that the contemporary Hebrew in the Second Temple period of the vernacular, which is embodied in rabbinic Hebrew or Tanaitic Hebrew, but for a functional reason, and this was to actually make a distinction between a nominal form, that is to say, ha-Yehudim amel alim, on the one hand, and a verbal predicative form, which is what the other instances of umlal were. So in this case, we're probably dealing with a case of possibly even adoption of this reading at the time of composition, because since it's such a late text. But we get other cases of the use of rabbinic forms to actually rabbinic vocalisms to express distinctions in meaning. For example, Karnaim versus Karanaim. This occurs in Habakkuk 3:4 when there's Karnaim, the normal dual form, it means raise, but Karanaim in Daniel 8 means horns. And the fact that Karanaim it has a distinct vocalism is not an accident, I think, and it corresponds to the dual form in early manuscripts of the Mishnah, such as Kaufman or Antonin or the Palmer manuscripts. So here again, we may have a case of a rabbinic form being allowed into the reading tradition in order to make a distinction in meaning. So, so there was a living growth of the reading tradition through licensing influence of language contact. And the aim was to achieve a maximally careful oral reading with optimal understanding and optimal articulation. Now, I haven't got time this afternoon to talk about the issues of various developments to create careful pronunciation articulation. I'm going to be focusing on the developments to make distinctions in meaning in order to achieve maximal and optimal understanding. Now, another case of a case of possible restructuring this time, which I would have happened in the Second Temple period, because this is where the roots of the Tiberian reading tradition are, which in fact is found in the Pentateuch, and so presumably this would be a case of restructuring of an original reading. Can be found in Exodus 1:19, I would suggest. So we have a distinction. We have this form chayot with a comets in Exodus 1:19 in the verse ki lo chanashim hamisriot ha'ivriot ki chayot hena. Now, because this is how in English Bible versions, this is normally translated as vigorous or vital, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous. Now, the point is that is this really an original reading, or is this some kind of restructuring? Now, it's quite revealing that the Samaritan oral tradition reads this as ayot, which is identical to the reading of chayot in Leviticus 14:4, where chayot in the Tiberian tradition has the dagesh, and it is the normal word for alive, so two live birds. Shittit siburim ayot. So this is possibly a case where the original hayot with a germination has been restructured for the sake of expressing distinction in meaning. In this case, hayot with the germination would be a more permanent property, like alive or a living creature, whereas hayot would be more dynamic and contingent, and that would be somehow analogous to a melalim umlalu distinction. Now, this phenomenon of restructuring to express distinction between a time-stable property or a nominal type property versus a contingent property is very commonly found in the Samaritan oral tradition. And the Samaritan oral tradition has a variety of morphological patterns for the participles. So in the participles corresponding to kotel, Tiberian kotel and cartel, there's 6 patterns of participles. I haven't really got time to go into to dwell on these too much, but the main point I want to make is that these participles, this sort of variety of different forms of participles, are put to a semantic function, or put to functional use, as shown by Ben Chaim and Moshe Florentine, in that they sort of like divide up the function between expressing permanent nominal properties versus contingent and verbal properties. And for example, an example I can give you is here, where in the participle of the verb to rise, the form qa'im is used to express, is a participle form used to express a verbal predication, whereas qam, that is to say the historical Hebrew participle, is used in a nominal sense. So qa'im is clearly a loan from Aramaic. So it's a sort of like, it is licensed, it's been a licensed loan. It's been brought in from the vernacular in order to serve a functional purpose. And so we get constructions like, or 37.7, v'hine qama alumati v'gam nitzava. Now, in the Tiberian Kamas, it looks like it's some sort of katal form, but in fact, the Samaritan oral tradition reads that as a participle, ka'ema, and my sheaf rises, and it's shown in the Samaritan Targum, mid-koma ma, it shows it's being interpreted as a participle, but a dynamic predicative verbal participle. Whereas in Deuteronomy 33:11, it's machatz mot naim kamav, equivalent in the Samaritan oral tradition, ma'etz marteni kamo, where kamo is the historical Hebrew participle form, and it is because it's essentially a nominal. It has a time-stable property. So that is a case of a parallel development in the Samaritan oral tradition, just to the examples I showed you in the Tiberian tradition or biblical Hebrew. Now, another piece of linguistic restructuring in the Second Temple period I would like to propose is the germination of the suffix in the vayiktol form, which is an innovation I would like to propose of apparently in the Second Temple period. It certainly was not an original feature. The point being is that this reflects my own view about the historical origin of the vayiktol form, and so I just spent a couple of minutes sort of going through this with you to explain what I mean. But so, although the scholarly consensus is undoubtedly correct that the roots of vayiktol go back to an old past yaktol form, in classical biblical Hebrew prose, I would like to argue that it came to be reanalyzed as a schematized extension of a dependent jussive form. So the Hebrew vayiktol form results from the reanalysis of the Old Semitic past yaktol as a jussive, specifically in discourse-dependent context. This was facilitated by its formal similarity to jussives and the syntactic similarity of such discourse-dependent contexts to constructions with jussives in dependent purpose clauses. So we're talking about purpose clauses like ve-yiktol, that sort of construction, so vav plus jussive, so-called without germination. So it is a cross-linguistic phenomenon that dependent purpose clauses like ve-yiktol often also express the result of a preceding action. For example, result clauses develop from the common implicature of purpose clauses that the event took place, especially after verbs of movement. For example, so you say, I went to buy some bread, as the implicature that I did in fact buy bread. And this conventionalization of an implicature is reflected as the expression of a real event that is reflected in result clauses, is the pathway of development of the construction to express dependent events, as in בר-אילן. So the old narrative construction of wow plus past perfective yiktol, expressing chains of events, was preserved by a process in which it was reanalyzed as an extension of a different but structurally similar construction. That is to say, vav plus jussive yiktol. So that very quickly is kind of my justification for saying, in fact, that the yiktol, the actual germination there, was originally not there, and it was actually added at some later point, and I'm assuming was there in the Second Temple period at least, and it was added, and it was an addition, and I'll try to justify this in a minute. So it is what I call germination to express distinction in meaning. By the time we get to the medieval reading traditions, the medieval vocalization traditions, this is of course expressed in the dagesh. And so we have a number of other cases of this dagesh mavchin, this dagesh to distinguish meaning, in forms like avir, which means powerful, is referring to God, and abir, powerful, referring to humans. The actual, in this case, the morphological forms katil and katil are sometimes morphological alternants, or kartil, I should say. There seems to be a typo there. So you get things like asir and asir, paritsim, prits construct seems to be a form without original germination. So the point is that this morphological alternance seems to have been exploited to actually for a functional purpose, to express distinction of meaning in a form such as abir and avir. But then it is sort of put to functional use. But then this was extended, it seems, to or various other contexts. So you get it in a variety of places in the Typean reading. So things like lo yihiye hazara, the offspring would not be his, where there's a dagesh put in the lo, and this is to distinguish the two otherwise homophonous forms. In the Babylonian tradition, you get a far more developed use of this dagesh mavchin, for example, to distinguish Israelite priests versus non-Israelite priests. The non-Israelite priests have a dagesh, kohanim, whereas the Israelite priests are kohanim without the dagesh. So going back to the ve-yiktol form, this, the argument being that this was originally some kind of extension of a purposive construction through a resultative, and then a sort of this was extended to express a real sequential dependent event. I mean, there are various bits of evidence for this, but I'll just mention one briefly here, is the fact that you get in ve-yiktol forms in the first person, already in the Pentateuch, you're getting this, the cohortative form, vaniftacha, used, which would be quite compatible with a purposive construction, but would not be compatible really with an all narrative, sort of regional narrative yaktol construction. Now, why do I argue this is an innovation, this germination? Well, not all traditions have it. The Samaritan tradition, as Aaron mentioned yesterday, has a different technique of distinguishing between the jussive and the narrative perfective use of yiktol. They actually have a suppletion, so they in a number of verbal forms they superimpose the reading tradition in the Vayiktol form, the Katal form, like Watarad, and she went down, is based on the pattern Kartal, whereas Terad is the ordinary Yiktol non-past form. It's not distinguished, and it has its original historical form. The point being is that in the Samaritan tradition, there's no germination as in Vayiktol, but this is simply alternative strategy. So it seems this was originally there was no germination there. So the germination was added in Vayiktol to distinguish meaning, to actually facilitate interpretation as of the form as past, as opposed to a kind of adjussive, purposive usage. Now, there are other cases of such restructuring in various other traditions. In the Yemenite reading tradition of Babylonian Talmudic Aramaic, for example, the plural active participle retains its historical vocalism in the first syllable when it has present tense reference. So we say kotle for the comets. But when this form, historically, the participle is interpreted as referring to the past, it has the form katle with a patach, which is an innovation. And that's a form of restructuring to express distinction in meaning, which is very kind of typologically very similar to what I'm arguing for the Vayiktol. Also, evidence that the germination is an innovation of the Second Temple period, I would claim, is that also in some of the traditions of Hebrew in late antiquity, you don't get the dagesh, or you don't get the germination, or certainly not regularly. For example, in Secunda transcriptions, you often don't get it, as Ben Cantor has shown in a recent article. So it's also in the Babylonian tradition, there's some variation. Sometimes you get a Vayiktol form in the Babylonian, where you get adjussive Veyashmi'u, for example, in Jeremiah 23:2. In Tiberian, you get adjussive, but you get Vayishmi'u interpreted as a past in Babylonian tradition. Also, Septuagint, the ancient versions often interpret a Vayiktol form as a Vayiktol form. But Tiv-K in 1 Samuel 1:7, a somewhat problematic form, has been presented as a Vayiktol, is actually interpreted as an imperfective habitual eklion, and she would weep in the LXX. Peshitta interprets it as past perfective. Similarly, you get a number of cases for example, in Habakkuk, actually 1 and 2, you get a number of cases where the Septuagint interprets the Vayiktol form as a future, as in here, Habakkuk 1:9, where Vayesof is translated Sunakse, and he shall gather. Whereas Targum translates Uchnash, that interprets it as a past. So there's different interpretations. And finally, I just say, I mean, I haven't got time, of course, to go into this, but there are plenty of Neo-Aramaic parallels to these developments I've been talking about. That is to say, there's development of a purpose clause into a narrative past tense, as perhaps I shall just show this example here, but there is definitely a parallel here. Now, then the third and final thing I want to talk about is this phenomenon of the spread of the Nifal and the PL in the reading tradition. I think it's actually, obviously, it's well known. It's nothing new. It's known that in Daniel 11:19 in the Kal in the Katal form of to stumble, or in this case the Bekatal, there's a Nifal, V'nichshal, but elsewhere the Kal form Kashal is used for the Katal. Whereas in the prefix conjugation, the imperfect, which is read as Yikashel, as Nifal. And basically this is the spreading of the Nifal, it being imposed on the form in the earlier period, in the let's say CBH, to places where parts where the orthography would actually accept the Nifal as within its vocal, without actually adapting the orthography. But this phenomenon, it seems to have been introduced from vernacular usage, because it's certainly very much the nifalization of intransitive verbs is very, very predominant. And you find many, many examples in Qumran and also in Rabbinic Hebrew in the early texts, early manuscripts at least. So nishkava you get in, whereas the equivalent would be shachba. So there's a certain limited amount of the introduction, restructuring of intransitive verbs in the Tiberian reading tradition as nifals, whereas there's a much wider phenomenon in sort of the spoken language, it seems, outside of the tradition. So, and you get it very much in Mishnah fragments. In various early Geniza fragments, you get nifals, yisafed, where you get safad in biblical Hebrew. So, and similarly, you get PLization, where in the verbs like geresh, which is, it seems as a PL, vocalism is imposed on an original Cal form in certain selected verbs in the Tiberian reading tradition, are crucially transitive verbs. So it's actually, what this process is doing is imposing a distinction in form on original Cal verbs, which are by their nature ambiguous as to their valency. So by introducing explicit marking of valency through nifals for the intransitives and PLs for transitive, this is a form of making distinctions, a form to express distinction meanings. And this phenomenon of PLization, as Steve has shown, Steve Fassberg, is much, much more widespread in say, Qumran, where we get many more cases of this. We get it in Mumakeret, for example, in this example I give of Nahum from the scrolls. And then in Rabbinic Hebrew, you get forms like Shimer in many of the early texts. And so you get, it's much more widespread. And this shows that the innovative morphological distinctions were not applied systematically, but only to selected lexical forms in the Tiberian reading tradition. And there's a parallel to this. I just like to say that this is not an artificial phenomenon, the phenomenon of disambiguating the basic simplex Cal stem into expressing transitive and intransitive by innovating the vocalism is a phenomenon you get in Northeastern Neo-Aramaic, whereas katil was the original form of the Cal stem in the past base, which could be transitive, intransitive. Muktel is the transitive stem vocalism of the causative, but there are some dialects like Jewish Sanandaj where the actual causative vocalism is imposed on the transitive stems of the past Cal. So this would be, again, a phenomenon in natural language. So we could see that we're dealing with a natural linguistic process. So to conclude, there was restructuring of morphology in the reading tradition of the Second Temple period to express morphological distinctions. And these formal distinctions facilitated interpretation of function. The innovative morphological distinctions were in most cases not applied systematically, but only to selected lexical forms. The source of the innovation in many cases appears to be the vernacular language, often resulting in mixing of earlier and later forms. There was living growth of the reading tradition through licensing the influence of language contact. The morphological developments have typological parallels in living Neo-Semitic vernacular languages. And there are differences in the application of the innovations across different reading traditions in the Second Temple period, or in later traditions with roots in the Second Temple period, such as Babylonian, Samaritan, and Hexapla. In some cases, these differences reflect differences in interpretation of morphosyntactic functions, such as Bar-Ilan. Okay, so thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you. Any questions? Benjamin Shuka.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I have a question about one of the first examples you shared, and I might have missed your point because it was a bit fast, but Kranaim in Daniel, in context, it's about an animal with two horns, and it's very relevant that they're exactly two. So my impression is that it's the vocalization here is meant to distinguish it from the pseudo-dual karnaim for horns and renew the force of the dual. Could that also be explained in the way you propose, or does it only really work as a distinction from rays?
Well, I mean, it's a very good point, Benjamin. I mean, I think that could well be another possible way of looking at it. I mean, normally what happens in these situations is that it's like what was going on was like what I call a Masoretic-like activity, whereby they try to innovate when there's to contrast with another element within the biblical tradition. So within the biblical corpus, if there's something in the corpus that wants that the tradition wants to distinguish, then they innovate. So I mean, the idea about Karnaim and Karanaim was that thinking, the Masoretic-like thinking of semantic distinctions between something else in the corpus, rather than specific meaning of that word in the context. Sure. But that it's a good idea. Thanks.
Thanks.
Nili? You're muted. Nili, you're muted.
Okay, was very instructive, thank you. So if I may, I want to suggest another example that I thought of recently. In Ezra 6, you have, that's Aramaic, but you have, ובנו ושכלילו מן טעם אלי ישראל ומתאם כורש. So you see that the Hebrew pronunciation ta'am is reserved for the command of the Israelite God. And then you have ta'am, the Aramaic form, for the Persian king. And it seems to be a theologically driven differentiation within the pronunciation tradition. And I think that the same tradition is also preserved in the Targumic tradition, but there it's lexical. So in the Targumic tradition, you have chok in the Hebrew Bible, but then if it is chukot hagoyim, it would be nimusa. And if it is a chok by God, it would be kiyam or something like that.
No, yeah, that's right. Absolutely, Nili. Thank you.
Can I ask about the introduction of what you say is an introduction of the germination in the Vayikdol form, a secondary introduction? Why wouldn't they just keep a distinction in the stress on the verbal form? Why do they need to introduce something that wasn't there?
Yeah, well, I mean, the stress is not always relevant in some strong verbs. I mean, that's the point.
Right, but you can, if you want to introduce a feature that is not there, stress is a natural feature in these forms in Hebrew. You can just extend it.
Yeah, the point is that, I mean, it was an extension as what I call the purposive construction with a jussive or short yiktol is the more accurate way to say. So in which case but in many cases we are not necessarily dealing with any sort of difference in form or stress position. I mean, really, in many cases we're dealing with a totally similar form. But I mean, what I'm trying to say is it's historically maybe a Yaktal form. I mean, I think it probably was the original, I don't know, early preterite Yaktal, but certainly in the time already in CVH has been reanalyzed as an extension of this sort of purposive short Yiktol construction, in which case there was no formal distinction, and the possibilities of making formal distinctions were perhaps, I mean, okay, in theory there could have been some kind of issues of stress in some verbs, it's true, weak verbs, but not, it doesn't work with strong verbs so easily. So I think there was clearly a need to feel that there was a way of expressing interpretation of the forms as past, which was somehow maximally efficient, really.
In many of the examples that you gave, the extensions was from features that actually existed, right? So a thematic vowel that meant intransitive, moving to market in other forms. But the germination here seems completely arbitrary.
Right. Well, it's a phenomenon of the use of germination for expressing semantic distinction, which is a very developed phenomenon within the Tiberian tradition, but even more so in other traditions. In Babylonian, in the Samaritan tradition, it is far more developed, and it's. I mean, I personally believe it's not even. It has its roots. I mean, this phenomenon can even be traced back to earlier Canaanite, in my view. My views about Bartim, for example, which you may not have read about. Well, of course you read it, but it's that's an issue. But certainly, it seems to have been extended from its usages such as a beer and a veer, which may have had originated in morphological alternance. But it definitely is an established strategy. Of distinguishing forms.
Noam?
Yes, thank you very much, Jeffrey. It was a really eye-opening paper, and I enjoyed it a lot. But perhaps following up in Ma's question, and I'm just thinking here out loud together with you, isn't there a sort of somewhat subtle difference between the Vaiktol cases and the other cases, in the sense that let's say abir, avir, asir, and asir are all cases which are phonotactically equivalent, because the replacement of a long vowel with a geminated consonant keeps like the phonotactic structure of the word in more or less the same. But the case of vaiktol, is not really equivalent, because vaiktol and vayiktol, the vaiktol form is much heavier. So I wonder if it represents, at least typologically, a somewhat more advanced stage of development.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extension. I mean, it's not, I mean, some of the forms like a beer might have been originated in morphological alternance. But the vast majority of cases of Dagesh Mavchin, if you like to call it that, but it wasn't Dagesh until, of course, the Middle Ages, but the germination started in the Second Temple period. Most of those cases are extension and so it would have been just this application of this technique. I mean, but there are many other cases like this where it's like Kohanim in the Babylonian tradition, and we know it's a germination because of the syllable structures. It's Kohanim with a patach between. So clearly, it's somehow not based on a direct morphological alternance, but it is actually just the phenomenon of the use of the Dagesh has been extended. So it's an extension, basically.
Thank you.
Harald?
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. Just a short question on terminology. Cases like the problematic 1 Samuel 1:7, vatifke, which is problematic in any case. There are other examples, many examples in Psalms and prophetic literature, which are vocalized as vaiktol forms, but where the quality as a vaiktol is doubtful in historical terms. So how would you call these examples? Pseudo-vaiktol simply, or do you have any other preferred term, just to make sure that we all know what we are talking about in the future?
Now, I think the main issue, and this is my argument, that is the phenomenon vayiktol is a Second Temple phenomenon, which reflects the way the biblical text was interpreted and received in certain traditions of the Second Temple period, what I call the Proto-Masoretic tradition. So it's not, we can't talk about historical vayiktols, it's just the way it's interpreted. And so my argument would be that vativke, for example, in that 1 Samuel passage, it's simply the way that verb was interpreted. Of course, the Septuagint interpreted something differently, that's the point. So it's not an issue of historical origin, it's the way it's been received, the reception history of the verbal system. And that is what we're seeing in the Vayiktol, which has come down to us in the Tiberian text. It's just the way it was interpreted in the Second Temple period, in the Proto-Masoretic tradition, not in all traditions. Septuagint has a different way of reading it. They wouldn't have read it with, presumably they didn't have any germination, but you know, you've got, you know, the Hexapla and the Samaritan tradition, they were not necessarily always interpreted in the same way. Babylonian tradition didn't always interpret the same way. That seemed to have a different, slightly different tradition. So there's already a question of interpretation.
Any additional questions? Yeah, Tanya.
Okay, if you give time, I'll ask the question. I understand the idea of dagesh being added to Victol at a more advanced stage, at the late biblical or even later stage, to distinguish it from other Yictol forms with Vav. I simply don't quite follow your idea that there was a kind of middle stage when it was reanalyzed as Joseph or as volitive paradigm, because, and you brought as an example first person cohortative uses Victol, but what about the second person? Because in volitive paradigm, the second person was used, the imperative forms were used. And apparently we don't see the imperative forms within the Victol paradigm. So it doesn't look like this preterite paradigm was altogether reanalyzed as just a volitive paradigm. So I'm not quite sure I understand why do we need this stage in between historical preterite once upon a time and then the later adding of dagesh in order to distinguish it from other Yictol forms? That's my question.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll start the end of the story. I mean, the reason it was actually, you needed to distinguish it with the germination, let's call it, because no dagesh in the Second Temple period, was a strategy to actually make, because by that time the argument would be that there was some degree of polysemy, if you like, or not the poly, but there's a wide semantic range of Vav plus Yictol. It ranged from Vav plus short Yictol. It ranged from purposive result sometimes, but also a narrative form. And so the reason there was germination was introduced was to try to distinguish this sort of, for the sake of orthoepy. The Second Temple period is the feature of the Second Temple period. Now, my argument is that in fact it was a means of preserving some kind of literary tradition of Yictol, which started off in the early Canaanite, and it was basically knocked out of the system in the CBH by Catal, but in order to somehow preserve the literary tradition of narrative, it kind of became, this is one of the factors that's stimulating it, it's being reinterpreted as as an extension of the purposive construction. In fact, we've already got roots of this in the Elamana letters, where Ipros is actually Ipros narrative preterite is actually typically most frequently preceded by U, and nobody's saying there it's a Joseph form, but it's somehow that is the kind of literary model, the formulas, the formulaic narrative. So that somehow was preserved by reanalysis. That was the main argument.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We will move to our